Today we're going to explore one of the most influential and easily one of the most controversial thinkers in modern American history. This is a huge influence in the West, and I'm guessing that most of you have probably heard of her. When I was about 18 years old, somebody invited me to a meeting of the Objectivist Club on the campus of the university I was attending, and for the most part, the meeting was pretty interesting. Ayn Rand, after all, regardless of how you might personally feel about her, was a pretty bright individual. And like countless young adults before me, I had already read two of her best-selling novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And I think at that point I might have also read her other short little dystopian novel, Anthem. So I got into the meeting, and it was mostly featuring an old black and white video where Ayn Rand was chain-smoking and expounding on her ideas in front of a very affirming audience. I mean, the people that were in that audience loved her. And when the video was over, the lights came back on, there was this short discussion, and then they served some refreshments. And that was also the last Objectivist meeting I ever went to. Not because I didn't find Ayn Rand appealing, I kind of did, or at least I found some of her core ideas appealing. I mean, she had escaped a brutal past in Russia where the communists seized their house and her father's business. And she had first-hand knowledge of what it's like to live under a totalitarian regime. My own family had been through something similar in the not-too-distant past. My father was born under Nazi occupation, which devastated his country. And years later, when he was 18, he emigrated to Canada, where he made a very nice life for himself. So in some ways, I kind of felt some empathy for Ayn Rand because, well, our families in the past both knew what it was like to experience the rule of a collectivist dictatorship. And both of us understood the life of an immigrant. But you know, she still lost me that night because of her rabid atheism. She didn't just state that she didn't believe in God, she virtually spit God's name in disgust, and for some reason, I found that to be a huge turnoff. Now, to be clear, back then I was not a practicing Christian, even though I was raised in a church-going home. I was going through what you might call my heathen phase, or maybe more accurately, my hedonist phase. So you could hardly describe me as a religious person. But still, the way she hated God was a turnoff, and somehow the way she was speaking also gave me the impression that her ego might be out of control. Now, to be fair, lots of people have inflated egos, and that doesn't mean their ideas are wrong. And because she insisted that she dealt in ideas rather than emotions, we should probably judge her by the content of her philosophy, maybe instead of the content of her character, although I'm not convinced the two things aren't related. But for now, let's just stick to her ideas. And in the appendix you find in some editions of Atlas Shrugged, there's a simple definition of objectivism. That's the name for her philosophy. And this definition comes from Ayn Rand herself. She says, "My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute." It's a system of thinking not entirely unlike some of the 19th and 20th century philosophers we discussed on other shows. And honestly, the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche in particular really does seem to show up in Ayn Rand's work. Now, what's interesting is that you won't find Ayn Rand's name in the table of contents of most of the philosophy textbooks at colleges, even though her influence on Western culture is undeniable. And there's little question that she should be considered a bona fide philosopher. After all, she spent most of her life pontificating on the various disciplines of philosophical pursuit, ranging from metaphysics and epistemology to ethics and aesthetics. And her following is big enough that even if you don't happen to like her, you'd still have to concede that she's definitely earned the title of philosopher. Personally, I believe part of the reason she's usually excluded is because of her politics. She leaned very heavily to the right, and most liberal arts colleges, well, they tend to lean the other way. Now let's get to objectivism. Ayn Rand believed, like most people do, that your life belongs to you. Nobody has the right to appropriate it or to force you into servitude. You get to live your life. And what Ayn Rand really admired was a person who used their lifetime to achieve great things. We all benefit, she argued, when people are allowed to pursue their personal ambition and engage in mutually beneficial exchange. So, when somebody has a vision to build something grand or to start a large company, everybody, she said, benefits. Take, for example, a company like Amazon. Even though Jeff Bezos made his mark well after Ayn Rand was dead, I'm guessing she would have loved this guy because his vision for a huge online distribution company has created hundreds of thousands of jobs and made everybody's life, well, a lot more convenient. The successful entrepreneur is the hero of Ayn Rand's philosophy. So on the surface, objectivism looks pretty good, and it seems to align with the so-called American dream. It's rugged individualism driven by ambition, and it's a model that fits the way Western civilization has managed to secure a level of widespread prosperity that has never before happened in the history of the world. And to a large degree, Ayn Rand's vision harmonizes with the Protestant work ethic, even though her reason for valuing hard work and ambition is quite different from that of the Reformers. To the Protestant of yesterday, work was an act of worship. They believed that we are condemned to live in a fallen world and we have to earn our living by the sweat of our brow. But we will do it to the best of our ability as a tribute to the Creator. Working in a fallen world to the Reformers was something to be thankful for, and you can use your labor to further the cause of God's kingdom. Your personal morality, your attention to detail, your willingness to invest yourself, your charity toward those in need, well, it all helps the world see the character of God. But for Ayn Rand, there was no God. The point of working and excelling at something is you, which is what she meant when she talked about the virtue of selfishness. Being true to yourself, she taught, produces an ethical lifestyle. And the requirement, now that's an important word, the requirement to expend yourself for the sake of others, well, Ayn Rand said that was unethical. Altruism as a public value, she said, is completely unethical, and it creates a collectivist mentality where the mob believes it has a right to the product of your labor, and so the mob appropriates your life by force. The Soviet Union, obviously, was a really good example of what she was driving at. It was the logical conclusion of state collectivism, where the state became more important than the individual. So, as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot in Ayn Rand's philosophy that I can admire because, well, she's not wrong about the dangers of statism and collectivism. I mean, just think about this. Christians have never, ever fared well under collectivist experiments because in order for collectivism to function at all, you really can't have freedom of conscience. Under collectivist experiments, people who think differently are considered dangerous. Christians, after all, were originally considered a threat to the Roman Empire. A Christian's first allegiance is to Christ, not to some deified emperor. And so the disciples of Christ were considered by the Romans to be a destabilizing force and a danger to the common good. And the same thing happened under the former Soviet Union. And those of you who happen to be of my age will remember the horrific stories of Christians and how they had to go underground in order to keep the faith. They were sent to labor camps in Siberia. They were generally disenfranchised. They were treated brutally and even killed for their faith. In the city of Budapest, you can still visit the House of Terror, a building where countless Christians were taken in the middle of the night and most of them never seen again. And I've actually talked to some of the people who lost family members in that place. We have even more recent examples coming from the largest communist experiment on the planet today, and that's China. Home churches established by Christians are bulldozed. Preachers are not free to say what they want, and tens of millions of Christians have to live in fear of what the state might do to them. And it's not just Christians by any stretch of the imagination. Members of Falun Gong and the largely Muslim Uyghurs give us even more proof that religious liberty never seems to go hand in hand with collectivism. In fact, over the course of the 20th century, collectivist ideology effectively turned half the world into a prison camp. Now, it looks like I've got to take a quick break, but don't you go away, because when we come back, we're going to take a look at how Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy doesn't do any favors for Christianity either.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
Ayn Rand was certainly quotable, and I don't know if it's her Russian heritage or not, but you can tell a lot of her novels were really thick, like other Russian authors. But even though they're long, they're pregnant with quotable moments like this one from Atlas Shrugged. This is an inscription on a building owned by the freethinker John Galt. It says, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." Now that right there is a pretty good summary of her objectivist philosophy. Now it doesn't rule out things like voluntary free exchange or generosity, but it does rule out things like coercion or groupthink. In this novel, this is an oath that people have to take, voluntarily of course, if they want to live in a free world created by this character, John Galt, the man who ditched the oppression of the collectivists to go out there and go it alone. Here's another quotable moment from her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. She says, "The smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities." Now, to some extent, that does kind of match the ethics of the Bible, where people are treated as individuals instead of just groups. Of course, the Bible also has clear group identities like the children of Israel. But within the group, individuals are valued highly and find themselves accountable directly to God. The Bible really does value the worth of the person, and the influence of the Protestant reformers and the English dissenters can still be felt in the American Bill of Rights. So on some levels, there is a little bit of harmony between the ethics of the Bible and the ethics of Ayn Rand. And maybe that's the reason Ayn Rand seems to have a following among American Christians, even though she was clearly an atheist. But then if you keep reading Ayn Rand in the Bible, you discover she clearly diverges from the actual ethics of Jesus. Now, in the time that we have today, there's no way I could do justice to this topic, and I know the disciples of Ayn Rand are going to be upset by what I say, because if Ayn Rand insisted on one thing, it was linguistic precision. Whether or not she actually achieved that for herself is another story, because her epistemology kind of fails the test, especially when you try to pin down her definition of the word reason. But maybe we'll come back to that some other day. Ayn Rand was so particular about her philosophy that she didn't even allow most of her students to call themselves objectivists, because that would imply they had something intelligent to say, and she didn't think they did. So she called them students of objectivism, because only she got to speak for the philosophy. Now, there were a few exceptions, like Nathaniel Branden, who was allowed to speak for this system of thought, but those people were exceptionally rare. Ayn Rand explained this way back in 1968 when she said, "Since objectivism is not a loose body of ideas, but a philosophical system originated by me and publicly associated with my name, it is my right and my responsibility to protect its intellectual integrity." And I guess that's probably one of the first red flags you find in the writings of Ayn Rand. I mean, it was certainly her right to make sure that people didn't misrepresent her. But at the same time, she spoke about objectivism like it was a hard science. She wasn't inventing truth, she insisted, but discovering it like a scientist would. Because as far as she was concerned, that's what philosophy is, a hard science that uses nothing but impartial reason. Now, here's the big problem with this. Nobody owns a scientific discovery. The law of gravity, for example, just exists. Even though Isaac Newton defined it, he doesn't own it. And if objectivism is really a hard science, the way Ayn Rand said, then it should be open to peer review. And there's no way she could own it. Author Ronald Merrill makes this point quite nicely when he says, "She," speaking of Ayn Rand, "seems to have forgotten that no one can own a scientific theory since it is not a creation but a discovery, an identification of reality." So, if her philosophy is really objective science, if this is really just the product of pure reason, then she should have been open to debate. And she wasn't. In fact, she refused to answer most people's questions, and she refused to debate because she always believed herself the smartest person in the room. If you saw holes in the way she thought, that's only because you're too dumb to understand her system the way that she did. Ayn Rand delivered monologues where students sat at her feet and dared not ask questions. And this was especially true in her later years when she became visibly impatient with people and often appeared angry when someone asked a question. Of course, the fact that she had an ego doesn't by itself make her thinking necessarily untrue, but the closure of debate and the insistence that there's only one expert in the room is often a red flag that you're dealing with a cult-like mentality instead of legitimate philosophy. And honestly, cult-like is a pretty good description of the objectivists I've interacted with over the years, even though a lot of them are obviously smart people. I just find it hard to escape this feeling that Ayn Rand has taken the place of God or revealed Scripture in some people's lives. I mean, she sits at the top of this philosophical system, not so much like a teacher, but more like an omniscient leader who cannot be questioned. You know, a cult leader. And no, I don't really believe that objectivism is a bona fide cult, and I know her followers would hate that description because they prize free thinking. But I also know I'm not the only one who's walked away with that impression, because a lot of time and effort has been devoted to the question of whether or not objectivism is actually a religious cult, because in a lot of ways, it behaves like one. Ayn Rand was known to scream at people who disagreed, and to be considered an objectivist meant passing an ideological purity test, and she was the only one who could decide who was worthy. But maybe with the time we have left, we should explore one or two of the many ways her system of thinking diverges from biblical Christianity. Now, there's a lot of things we could cover, like the fact that she insisted, like John Locke, that human beings are born with nothing in their brains and they build their identities and knowledge using nothing but pure reason. But for today, what I think I want to do is explore maybe just one important way that her perception of the value of the individual actually differs from the way the Bible presents the same subject. But before we do that, I do have to take another break, so you sit tight and I'll be right back.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
If there's one thing Ayn Rand made perfectly clear, it's that she had no patience for Christians. Altruism, the act of living for others, was anathema to her, so she absolutely deplored the idea that somebody would ever sacrifice himself for others, like Christ. Of course, from her perspective, she was talking about coercion, where somebody is compelled to live for the sake of other people, and I have to admit, I probably have some sympathy there. I mean, if you're pressured into sacrificing yourself or you're compelled to do it by law, I'm not convinced there's actually any moral value to what you're doing. But what the Bible discusses is voluntary altruism, a voluntary willingness to put others ahead of yourself. For example, take that really famous admonition from Paul that I bring up just about every other week. It's from the book of Philippians, and it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross." Now you notice, this is completely voluntary. Nobody made Christ leave the glory of heaven to come and save us. It was his idea. And that's what makes it so incredibly touching. And Paul's advice to live like Christ starts with the word let. In other words, it implies self-motivation and the freedom to choose. What Ayn Rand really railed against, and I can understand why, is the way that worldly governments will force you to sacrifice for something they call the common good, which of course is really hard to define. I mean, who gets to decide what you sacrifice if not you? And who gets to decide what the common good is if it's not a bunch of powerful people who have, well, the same weakness for serving self that you and I have? Letting powerful people tell the rest of us how to live almost always has unintended consequences because mere human beings cannot make perfectly informed decisions. And their decisions result in more misery, usually, for somebody. So I understand Ayn Rand's distaste for compulsory sacrifice. But the self-sacrifice described in the Bible is different. Ayn Rand may have still detested it, but it's different. The Bible grants freedom of conscience. You are allowed to live any way you want, even if you're going to reject God. I know some people will insist that's not true because the nation of Israel had legally enforced morality with penalties attached to it. I mean, there was a penalty for adultery and a penalty for blasphemy and a penalty for all kinds of things that our modern world would never want to penalize. But again, there's a difference. The nation of Israel was founded on a voluntary contract with the Creator. They didn't have to be the chosen people, but they wanted to. And so they signed a covenant, and a covenant always has terms and conditions. What's hard to escape, however, is the notion of freedom that you find in the pages of the Bible. Back in the book of Genesis, God allowed our first parents the freedom to choose for Him or against Him. They were placed in a garden where they were perfectly free to eat from all the trees but one. If you eat from that tree, God said, that will lead to death. Now, there wasn't anything magical or toxic about that tree. It appears to have existed for just one reason: to provide freedom of choice. The Bible defines God as a God of relationships and love, and in order to be able to love freely, there has to be the possibility of choice. For example, the reason I really value my relationship with my wife is because it's voluntary. When I get home from a long trip and she's still there at my house, I know it's because she wants to be, and that means something to me. But you know, if I get home and she's chained to the coffee table and I say, "Hey, look at that, you're still here," well, that doesn't make sense. There's nothing meaningful about that. So in order to live freely, to be able to freely enter into a relationship with God, the freedom to choose against God has to be there. And that's what you have in Eden, the ability to choose against God. That way nobody can point to the relationship and suggest that it's coercive, because it's not. Now, that doesn't mean that God didn't warn our parents about the consequences of walking away. He is, after all, the only source of life in the universe, and to sever your connection to God will always have tragic consequences. So He told them what would happen if they chose to go it alone. But He didn't make it impossible to leave. There's another good example in the Old Testament where Joshua encourages the Israelites to remain faithful to God after they had been unfaithful in a number of different ways. Notice what Joshua actually says. "And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Again, it's the freedom to choose, and that's a really important concept in Christianity. I know the church behaved rather badly during the Middle Ages, and we compelled people to worship a certain way. But that was an aberration. It was a departure from the principles of our founding document. God does not force, and that means that Christians have an obligation to respect the rights of others. Forcing people to accept Christianity is plainly out of bounds. Of course, that doesn't mean that we can't support good, moral, civic laws, particularly those that are related to the second table of commandments. Moral principles like "you shall not kill" or "you shall not steal" respect the rights of the individual, and they place a distinct value on other people. Those are good laws, common sense moral values that benefit everybody. Where Christians run into trouble, though, is when they try to enforce the first table of commandments through civic laws, the commandments that describe our personal duty to God. You cannot force other people not to take the Lord's name in vain or to observe the Sabbath and so on. Now, I've got to take one last quick break, and then we'll come back to summarize what it is that I'm really driving at.
Are you searching for answers to life's toughest questions like, where is God when we suffer? Can I find real happiness? Or is there any hope for our chaotic world? The Discover Bible Guides will help you find the answers you're looking for. Visit us at BibleStudies.com or give us a call at 888-456-7933 for your free Discover Bible Guides. Study online on our secure website or have the free guides mailed right to your home. There is never a cost or obligation. The Discover Bible Guides are our free gift to you. Find answers in guides like, Does my life really matter to God? And A Second Chance at Life. You'll find answers to the things that matter most to you in each of the 26 Discover Bible Guides. Visit BibleStudies.com and begin your journey today to discover answers to life's deepest questions.
Ayn Rand appeared to believe, like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, that the universe somehow answers to us. Now that's a little simplistic because neither of those philosophers really believed the universe had any real meaning attached to it anyway. But they did suggest that the best path in life is to just accumulate power and use it to carve out a better existence for yourself. Ayn Rand essentially taught the same thing, and it's no surprise because she was a huge fan of Nietzsche. Her highest ideal was the noble hero, the one who beats the odds and really makes something of himself. And I say himself on purpose because for some strange reason, Ayn Rand actually put limits on the ambitions of women, even stating publicly that they should never, ever be president of the United States. The individualism of Ayn Rand's objectivism was completely self-serving, and it assumed that the universe is here to serve us. Christianity, on the other hand, believes that the universe answers to a creator, and the universe was made as a reflection of who that creator is. We understand that we've been given free moral agency, and that God invites us to answer to Him. What Christianity teaches essentially is that you really are your own person and that you don't need some kind of middleman that stands between you and God. You are free to choose. But what happens if you understand that the universe does not exist for you and you voluntarily submit to the God who made it? Well, in that case, you discover that the universe absolutely bends in God's direction, and that's a feature He's willing to share with you because it turns out God also voluntarily lives for you. Listen, like Ayn Rand, I do not recognize any right on your part to call the shots in my life. But quite unlike her, I readily acknowledge God's right to call the shots in my life. And I'm quite happy to submit to that arrangement because I've come to realize I can't lose when I'm in the hands of a loving and merciful God. Well, that's it for this week. I've talked too long and I've completely run out of time, and I guess that quick summary of one of the most influential writers in American culture is just going to have to do for now. Maybe we'll come back to it on another week. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another edition of Authentic.